There are a few places in the South more associated with family vacations than Pigeon Forge. Located at the doorstep of the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, Pigeon Forge built its identity around tourism, hospitality, and family entertainment. For decades, visitors have traveled there for mountain cabins, roadside attractions, souvenir shops, and the natural beauty of East Tennessee. It is a place many Southerners know well, either from childhood vacations or annual family trips. By the mid-1980s, transformation was accelerating. Tourism was booming. New businesses were opening. And in 1986, Dollywood began bringing even more attention and investment to the area. Pigeon Forge was growing fast, but it still carried the image of a safe mountain town, a place associated with music, family, and tradition. That is what makes the events of July 1987 so unsettling. On the afternoon of July 11th, 1987, Ann Robertson Jones was found dead inside her home. Within a short time, investigators understood they were dealing with a case far more disturbing than a simple robbery or murder. The evidence suggested something deliberate, personal, and deeply troubling. The investigation would eventually center on two people, a 27-year-old named Gary Caughron and a 14-year-old girl named April Ward. What exactly transpired in Ann's home would become one of the most disturbing murder cases in the history of Pigeon Forge. Welcome back to the Southern Blueprint Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Swift. Today we are heading to Pigeon Forge, Tennessee for a truly gruesome story. I've covered some dark cases on this show before, but this murder is particularly brutal, disturbing, and a little difficult to process. So as always with my true crime episodes, listener discretion is advised, especially if you have younger ears around. Before we jump in, if you enjoy this podcast and want to help support what we're building here at the Southern Blueprint, one of the easiest and most impactful things you could do is leave a 5-star rating, a review, or a comment wherever you listen to your shows. Reviews really do help more people discover the show, and it just helps this podcast continue to grow. If you want even more Southern Blueprint content, consider joining the Hidden Pond Lodge, which is our Patreon community, and really the inner circle of this whole operation. Inside the Hidden Pond Lodge, you get access to bonus podcast content, behind-the-scenes discussions, extra posts, and just a growing community of people who love Southern culture. You also get access to our community Discord server, which is essentially our private online community chat space. Think of it as a digital lodge where we hang out and talk, about whatever throughout the week. We have dedicated channels to all types of topics like history, folklore, books, birding, fly fishing, cigars, bourbon, travel, hiking, and just about everything else that fits the Southern Blueprint lifestyle. To everyone who listens, supports, shares episodes, or joins the lodge, or simply just spends time with me each week, thank you so much. I genuinely appreciate it more than you know. But now, let's head back to Tennessee. In July of 1987, Ann was 42 years old. The available public record does not give us a full portrait of her private life like some other high-profile cases. But what we do know is that Ann was a mother and a local business owner. She operated a shop in one of the busiest kind of communities in East Tennessee, a tourist town built around visitors, traffic, souvenirs, and the steady movement of people in and out of the mountains. Pigeon Forge sits near the entrance of the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. The park itself had long been one of the region's biggest draws, bringing families to the Tennessee side of the Smokies for vacations, weekend trips, honeymoons, church retreats, school breaks, and long summer drives through the mountains. My family and I were just recently there. We had a fantastic time. It is a truly beautiful place. But by the 1980s, Pigeon Forge had become more than a quiet stop on the way to the national park. It was turning into a destination of its own, and it was growing fast. In 1986, Dollywood opened. Now, the park used to be called the Silver Dollar City, but now Dolly Parton is attached to this. Now it's called Dollywood. The park, under a new name, drew 1.3 million visitors in its first season, a major increase from the year before. For Pigeon Forge, that meant more attention, more cars, more tourists, and more opportunity for local businesses trying to capture a piece of that growing economy. Ann Robertson Jones was one of those business owners. She ran the Wild Hare T-shirt Shop in Settlers Village. Now, Settlers Village placed Ann's shop close to other small businesses, and one of those businesses was called the Turquoise Jewelry Shop, where a woman named Letty Marie Cruz worked. Now, Letty had a daughter named April Ward, and in the summer of 1987, April was 14 years old. Because her mother worked in Settlers Village, April spent a lot of time around the shopping center. There was a covered portico there that people commonly refer to as simply the porch. It was kind of a shared space where people could shop, they could linger, they could talk, smoke, wait for someone getting off work, or just pass the time without necessarily having a reason to be inside one particular store. In a small commercial area, a space like that becomes familiar quickly. The same faces appear. Employees notice who is hanging around. Business owners notice who comes and goes. Now, much of what we know about this case comes from April herself. That is something that we need to keep in mind here. There are certainly facts and details that we know to be true, but April fills in a lot of the gaps. That summer, Gary Caughron was working on a nearby construction project. According to April's later testimony, her and Gary met in the early summer and became romantically involved. The age difference was not a small detail. Again, April was 14, Gary was 27. April said she and Gary met almost every day on that porch at Settlers Village. Gary's parents divorced when he was very young. His aunt Gladys would later say that his childhood was chaotic at best. She described Gary as slow, a word that appears in court record as part of her later testimony in the case. A clinical psychologist would later testify that Gary's full-scale IQ was measured at 78, placing him in what the court described as just above the classification then referred to as mentally retarded. And we don't say that, of course, now, but back then, that's what they labeled him as. Gary's father was an alcoholic and had physically abused Gary's mother before the divorce. The psychologist described the father as overtly psychotic. Gary spent portions of his childhood staying with relatives. But by the summer of 1987, Gary found himself in Pigeon Forge. After April and Gary started seeing each other, April told her mother, Letty Cruz, that Gary was 18. Others started noticing that a relationship was forming between an adult man and a teenage girl and became concerned. Ann Robertson Jones was one of those people that was concerned. According to April, Ann had spoken to Letty, April's mom, about April's inappropriate relationship. April became angry at Ann because she believed Ann was trying to separate her from Gary by going to her mother. There was also a separate encounter involving Ann and Gary inside the Wild Hare T-shirt shop. 2 or 3 weeks before Ann was killed, Gary came into the shop after drinking and was creating a disturbance inside her store. Now, Ann made him leave and banned him from the store entirely. Afterward, according to April, Gary was extremely angry. April said Gary talked about catching Ann, quote, out one night and said he wanted to, quote, slice Ann's throat. She also said that Gary wanted April to try and follow Ann home from work so she could tell him where Ann lived. Gary also asked April to watch Ann as she closed the shop, see where she put the money, and try to find out whether Ann was married, had a telephone, and had pets. In the week before the murder, April said the conversation with Gary about Ann became more specific. And by Friday, July 10th, 1987, April said Gary was no longer speaking in general threats. That afternoon, sometime around 3 p.m. or 4 p.m., Gary came by April's house. He was driving an older green and white Oldsmobile that he had recently purchased. According to April, Gary told her he would come back later that night, and they would go to Ann's house. The rest of the day passed in an ordinary way. Pigeon Forge was in the middle of a summer Friday. Shops were open. Tourists were moving through town. Families were headed toward restaurants and attractions. Ann Robertson Jones was going through what would become the final hours of her life. Later that night, April waited for her mother to fall asleep. After Letty was asleep, April cut a blue terry cloth towel into strips. Sometime after midnight, Gary returned for her. Now, Vicki Worth, who knew Gary, would later testify that she had seen Gary earlier that night around 10 p.m. or 11 p.m., drinking beer and smoking marijuana at a restaurant. When Gary picked April up, April said that he'd been drinking, though she did not describe him as drunk. But on the way to Ann's house, April said they drank more alcohol and also took drugs. When they arrived, they did not park directly at Ann's house. April said Gary parked in a lot of a nearby nursing home, and from there, they walked. Gary carried a handle of a pool stick wrapped in gray duct tape. April had the towel strips that she had cut, and she also said Gary gave her a knife. Gary went into the house first by himself, then called April to come in. Once she joined him, they moved through the house silently and down the hallway toward Ann's bedroom. Ann knew someone was inside the house. April said she heard Ann calling from the room. "Who is it? What are you doing here?" The bedroom door was locked. Gary kicked it in. Once the door opened, Ann cried and pleaded with them not to hurt her. April said both she and Gary told Ann she was going to die. Gary hit Ann several times with the pool stick, and after those blows, Ann fell across the bed. The order of events inside the bedroom is one of the difficult parts of the case. April described a series of actions, but even the court later said her testimony was confusing about the exact timing of the events. But at some point, Ann was gagged. April said the purpose was to stop any screaming. Ann was also tied to the bed. April used the strips of the blue towel that she had cut up and brought. Those materials matched what investigators would later find, along with off-white fabric used to bind Ann's arms and legs to the bed. April said Gary tightened one of the terry cloth strips around Ann's neck and then tried to sexually assault Ann, but was unable to complete the act. After that, Gary turned his attention to April. Gary suggested that him and April have sex. So, the two undressed and had sex on the floor beside of the bed where Ann lay. During that act, April said Gary rubbed Ann's blood on both of their bodies. Now, Dr. Cleland Blake would later testify that Ann received several blunt force injuries to the head. Her skull was fractured, cartilage in her nose was displaced, and she had bled extensively from her mouth and nose. Then came one of the most disturbing parts of April's account. April said Gary produced some shot glasses and that Gary insisted they drink some of Ann's blood from those shot glasses. Afterward, April said she went into the bathroom because she felt like she was going to throw up. But she said she never actually vomited. When she came back to the bedroom, she said Gary was striking Ann's back with that pool stick handle. The medical examiner would later conclude Ann died from asphyxiation while unconscious, not directly from the blows to the head. The blows were severe, no doubt, but the actual cause of death was suffocation caused by the tight gag. The terry cloth strips around Ann's neck was cutting off blood flow to the brain and hemorrhaging in her nasal passages. As Gary and April were leaving, April said Gary dumped the contents of Ann's purse on the ground and took what appeared to be a large amount of money. Outside the house, April said Gary used a knife to cut the telephone lines. She said he did that to make it look like whoever had killed Ann had cut the lines to keep her from using the phone, which personally is a weird detail. I'm not sure why you wouldn't do that first before going into the house, but anyway, they left Ann's property and walked back towards the Oldsmobile. April said that they then tried to wash the blood from their bodies in the river behind a store in Pigeon Forge. And after that, they drove to Dollywood. Now, again, I'm telling you this story based largely on what April, her testimony, and what she said in interviews to the police and everything like that. Now, at Dollywood, they met several people. One of them was Kevin Carver. And April said Carver threatened to harm her if she got Gary in trouble. Now, this whole part of the story is strange because the record gives almost no context for any of this. It does not say they entered the park or entered Dollywood as visitors. It does not, describe the rides, crowds, employees, anything that sounds like a normal visit to Dollywood. Not sure why they met these people there or how they know Kevin or why Kevin threatened April. Again, this is all based on what April gave law enforcement. And I'm just adding it here because that's in the record. But there's really no context around it. She also doesn't give an exact time. Now, the park typically doesn't open till like 9 or 10 a.m., so maybe they just met friends near Dollywood or just in the parking lot. Again, it's kind of an odd thing to do after, you've killed somebody gruesomely and you've got blood on you and everything like that. And I don't know if these people were aware or anything like that. I'm just throwing that in there because it's part of April's account. But later that same morning, around 10 a.m. or 11 a.m., now we do have a time, Gary arrived at Settlers Village. Now, several witnesses saw him there. He was wearing cut-off jeans and tennis shoes. He had scratches all over him. And several people described seeing dried blood on him. Some of these details are also strange. Not sure if Ann had maybe fought back. Again, April didn't really say that in her testimony, but, Gary is kind of covered in scratches. I guess we can maybe assume that Ann did, but I don't like to assume things. But apparently he had scratch marks all over him. Letty Marie Cruz, April's mother, commented on his appearance and said he looked like, quote, some sort of wild woman got a hold of him the night before. Gary gave her an explanation. He said that he had gotten in a fight over a beer in a bar in Newport, and then he went and cleaned himself off in the store restroom. Robert Yoakum, who was Letty Cruz's boyfriend at the time, also saw him and sort of teased him about the blood. And Gary gave him a different explanation. He said, quote, a bitch had hit him in the head with a beer bottle. Gary then took April aside and warned her not to tell what had happened. Gary and April left Settlers Village with Robert Yoakum and went to Letty Cruz's house, where Gary took a bath there. And I must interject here. I'm still not sure why Letty is letting her 14-year-old be around Gary at all, especially after her conversation with Ann. And I'm not sure why Robert Yoakum, the boyfriend, why he wouldn't say anything. And why Letty, not looking at Gary with all these scratches and everything else, be like, you know what, maybe you shouldn't be around my super young daughter, no matter how old you are. But anyway, later that day, Gary spray painted the Oldsmobile that he had to silver. April said he told her he painted it so anyone who had seen the car the night before would not be able to identify it. Again, this is according to April. There was later testimony connected to that car. Tom Bentley, who worked on Gary's car after the killing, said he used pieces of a blue terry cloth towel from the trunk as grease rags. He said those rags matched the toweling shown at trial, the same kind of material used to bond Ann. In the early afternoon of July 11th, 1987, Ann's daughter Christy went to her mother's home. Inside, she found Ann's body laying face down on the bed. The scene was brutal. The bedroom door had been forced open. Ann's purse and its contents were scattered in the hallway. The telephone lines to the house had been cut. There were other details at the house that would not make full sense right away. Ann's truck was still parked outside, and there were still items in it. Christy also later testified that her mother's pink Oral-B toothbrush was missing after the killing. And a few weeks later, Christy found a silver turquoise ring lying on the ground beside Ann's truck. But they did not solve the case on day one, or the first week, or the first month, or the first couple of months. For nearly a year, police developed leads, but those leads did not pan out. The case remained open. Investigators had a horrific crime scene, but they did not yet have the full account that would eventually become the center of the prosecution. That changed on June 22nd, 1988. On that day, investigators took the first of 6 statements from April Ward. April's mother noticed her daughter was crying constantly, and she was struggling in school and emotionally distressed. It was time to talk, and there was enough circumstantial evidence to get her talking. Now, I don't know exactly what officially prompted April to come forward, but I would imagine as a 14-year-old being involved in that horrific murder that, she's crying a lot, she's struggling, just emotionally, distressed. But I don't know what exact moment that changed, or it was just a combination of things. But yeah, Letty was like, okay, what's going on? I'm assuming April was, let her know, and it was like, okay, it's time to go and talk to the police. However, in April's first statement, she denied knowing the details of Ann's murder. But even while denying direct knowledge, she made allegations implicating Gary. You see, by then, April and Gary were no longer romantically involved. As April gave more statements, her account changed and expanded. That became one of the central tensions of the case. She eventually gave investigators the story that placed both herself and Gary inside of Ann's house. But she was also an accomplice, and her statements were not all consistent. Once April began talking, details that had been sitting in the investigation started to connect things back to Gary. Again, April was able to start filling in some of these gaps. The ring Christy found near Ann's truck, yeah, remember that? That matched the description of a ring Letty Cruz said she had sold to Gary. The missing toothbrush became suspicious because Ann's daughter Christy said, again, Ann's Oral-B toothbrush had gone missing after the murder. And Letty later said that while Gary was staying at her house shortly after the killing, she noticed he had what she considered an odd toothbrush for a man. A pink toothbrush with a little rubber tip. Piece by piece, the case began to build. Not because one object solved everything, but because April's account gave investigators a framework. And then there was the ring. Then you have the towel pieces, the car. Then you have the toothbrush, Gary's behavior the morning after the murder, and his later statements all became part of the same story. There was one more witness whose testimony gave prosecutors another way to connect April's description of the murder to Gary's life before the crime. His name was Jimmy Husky. Husky had known Gary in 1986, the year before Ann was killed. He testified that Gary owned a pool stick that came apart, similar to the kind April described when she talked about the weapon used inside Ann's bedroom. Husky also said Gary kept light-colored lace tablecloth or curtain material in his car, similar to the sheer material used to tie Ann to the bed. Then Husky added another detail. He said that Gary had talked about tying up women during sex. He also said Gary had made comments about slapping women on the ass. That testimony gave the prosecution something beyond the physical items themselves. It connected the pool stick, the sheer material, and one of the injuries found on Ann's body to things Gary had allegedly talked about before the murder. See, Dr. Cleveland Blake had found superficial bruising on Ann's right buttocks and described it consistent with a hard slap inflicted while she was still alive. So essentially, Gary had slapped Ann on the butt and had left a bruise, basically. April had said Gary slapped Ann there after attempting to sexually assault her. So Husky's testimony gave the injury another reason to believe that part of April's account. And that had, April wasn't just making this up. It linked everything together. But this was still not a simple case. There was no confession in the ordinary sense. There was no fingerprints inside of Ann's house that placed Gary there. There was no clean forensics results tying him, Gary, to the bedroom. So investigators and prosecutors had to build the case through the statements, the witnesses, the objects, behavior, and all of the contradictions. During the summer of 1988, Gary gave law enforcement several statements. He first denied knowing Ann at all. He denied being involved in her death. He denied what witnesses said he had done the morning after the killing. He denied being in a fight in a bar in Newport. That was one of the explanations that he gave the morning after. Even though, he told, people that. He also gave different accounts of how he ended up with the scratches and the blood. At one point, he had said he had stayed at his grandmother's house the night that Ann was killed. He also said he'd been riding around with a friend and that friend's wife at the time of the murder. As the questioning continued, Gary became more nervous. At one point, when he was asked who killed Ann Jones, he said, "Whoever done it needs help." Another time he said, and this is a quote, "If I'm convicted of what I've done, someone will have to pay." It's an odd quote, for sure. And after one interrogation session, Gary tried to kill himself. When he was asked why why are you doing that? He said he was depressed and had a lot on his mind. In his final interview, investigators confronted him with all of the all of his falsehoods in the early statements that he gave. Gary became very upset and just simply walked out of the room. So law enforcement had enough, I guess, probable cause or, reason to jail Gary. Now, while Gary was in jail, he talked to a couple of inmates, and those inmates would later come forward, basically saying that Gary admitted to the crime or even told details about the crime. At one point, he had mentioned losing a ring. Again, I won't go into a lot of detail of that because, it's a lot of hearsay and everything like that. I'm trying to stick to the facts, but why he was incarcerated, supposedly some of the inmates that he was with came forward to give some of their testimony. By the time the case moved toward trial, prosecutors had built a picture of several different kinds of evidence. Now, you had April Ward's account. They had the crime scene that matched portions of what April described in detail. They had witnesses who saw Gary at Settlers Village the morning after the murder with scratches and dried blood on him. They had the green and white Oldsmobile that was painted silver. Later, they had Tom Bentley's testimony about that blue terry cloth pieces that, he saw in Gary's trunk and they used for grease rags. And then, of course, they had the ring that was found beside Ann's truck. And Letty, gave testimony that, yeah, she had sold that very ring to Gary. So, kind of damning evidence there for sure. Then there was that missing toothbrush from Ann's home. Letty again had said that she observed Gary using a similar or the exact toothbrush. Then you had Jimmy Husky's testimony about the pool stick, the sheer material in Gary's car, and then, talking about how Gary liked to tie up women and then slap them on the butt, everything like that. And then they had Gary shifting stories. And they also had the inmates, too, that were coming for him. But the defense had a case to make, too, and the weaknesses were not minor. Forensic testing did not connect Gary to the crime scene. His fingerprints were not found inside Ann's home. Testing and analysis from forensic scientists with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and the FBI did not place him there there was no blood, there were no other fluids. Now, him and April had sex in that room. They couldn't find any blood from either one of them, no other fluids, no fibers, no hair, and no shoe prints. And there was a problem with the shoe print that they did find. Now, when I say they didn't find a shoe print, they did not find a shoe print of Gary. Now, they made a plaster cast of a shoe print found outside of Ann's house that was consistent with a boot owned by Kenneth Ogle. Kenneth had been a boyfriend of Teresa, one of Ann's daughters. His name already had history connected to Ann's home. In September of 1986, Kenneth had broken into the house, threatened Teresa at knife point, pushed her onto the bed, and tied her hands together. Now, all of that doesn't mean that he killed Ann Robertson Jones, but it certainly gave the defense another person to point towards, and it's a pretty good person to be pointing towards. A man connected to the family, connected to the home, and connected to a prior violent incident inside that house. The defense also challenged the meaning of the painted car. There were 3 witnesses testified that Gary had a habit of spray painting old junker cars different colors. And his aunt testified that on Friday night, after he bought the green and white Oldsmobile, he came to his grandmother's house around 11 p.m. or around midnight and went straight to bed. The defense also wanted more time to examine the bedroom door. There was a footprint on the door, and the defense wanted to show that the print was larger than Gary's would have been. Now, we've got that footprint cast of Kenneth Ogle. The defense is wanting to check the door and everything like that to compare Gary's foot size to Kenneth's maybe, or just to try to, of course, rule out Gary because allegedly he kicked the door in to Ann's bedroom. At trial, Sandra Lee Paltora, I think that's how you say her name. She's a forensic scientist specializing in shoe track analysis, testified that the print on the door was consistent with a smooth sole shoe rather than the tennis shoe Gary had supposedly been wearing that night. That point gave defense another way to attack April's version of events as well. April said Gary kicked in the bedroom door, but if the mark on the door did not match the shoe, either April's account was wrong on that detail, and they're trying their best to say April's testimony is not reliable. And if she got that detail wrong, she may have gotten all the other details wrong as well. So the prosecution had a narrative. They had April's testimony. They had the evidence, whether it's circumstantial or not. They had these items of evidence. The defense tried their best to raise doubt. The jury had to decide whether April Ward's account, supported by the surrounding pieces, was strong enough to overcome everything the defense had raised. The lack of forensic evidence tying Gary directly to the scene. The questions about April's changing statements. The possibility that someone else could have been responsible, like maybe Kenneth. The trial lasted 4 days, and at the center of it all was April. She was the witness who placed herself and Gary inside Ann's house. She was the witness who described the planning, the walk from the nursing home parking lot, the entry into the home, the bedroom, the attack, the attempt to clean up afterwards, and Gary warning her not to talk. But she was also an accomplice, right? And her story had changed. Before trial, April had given 6 separate statements to police. Those statements totaled 64 pages. They were turned over to the defense at 7:15 p.m. on the evening before April was to testify. Along with those statements, the defense received more than 100 pages of material, roughly 20 possible state witnesses as well. So the night before April was to testify in court, the prosecution sent over all of those statements for the defense to look over. The next morning, Gary's defense attorney told the court he had not had enough time to review all of this. Later that day, when the state called April as its 4th witness, the defense asked for more time before cross-examining her. The attorney said he had only been able to review one of April's statements and needed the night to go through all the rest of the stuff. The judge denied that request. That meant the defense had to question the most important witness in the case, the teenage accomplice, whose account placed Gary inside Ann's house with very little time to compare her trial testimony against the 6 statements she had given before the trial. For the prosecution, April's testimony gave the case its spine. For the defense, April's testimony was exactly where the case was most vulnerable. She had been 14 years old when Ann was killed. She had been involved with a 27-year-old man. She had given multiple statements. Her account had changed multiple times. And yet she was the person telling the jury what happened inside that house. So as the trial moved towards its end, the question was not whether Ann Robertson had been murdered. That was beyond dispute. The question was whether the state had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Gary was the man responsible for premeditated first-degree murder first-degree burglary and assault with intent to rape. The jury reached a mixed verdict. Gary was found not guilty of felony murder, robbery, and larceny, but he was found guilty of premeditated first-degree murder. Put more plainly, the jury did not believe prosecutors had proven the robbery and the theft charges, but they definitely found him guilty of that premeditated first-degree murder. I had to read that a few times because I couldn't quite understand the felony murder, robbery, and larceny. That was all lumped together. They couldn't prove the robbery and theft. They just went with the premeditated first-degree murder. And for Ann's murder, the state sought the death penalty. The sentencing phase was much shorter than the trial itself. The state did not present any additional proof. The defense called 4 witnesses on behalf of Gary. The first person that they called was Gary's aunt, Gladys Green, who I mentioned at the very beginning of the story, and she told the jury about his childhood, his dad, his upbringing, the divorce, and he described Gary as slow. Next, they called a minister named Harold Stofel. He said that Gary had accepted the word of God, was respectful, and was one of the finest young prisoners he had ever seen. They also called in Edward Moore, who was a jailer at the county jail, and he testified that Gary had not given any problems. He was a great inmate, all things considered. And then they brought in a clinical psychologist to testify to the fact that Gary's IQ was 78. And that's where, she classified him then, what they called mentally retarded. She said he'd been placed in special education classes as he was, growing up and everything like that. She also discussed the family background, the father being, overtly psychotic. Again, I mentioned kind of all this at the beginning of the show. She also said that she believed Gary would not be a physical threat to society or to other inmates if he were in prison or even out of prison, which I find that kind of odd to believe. But on cross-examination, she acknowledged 2 important things. Gary was not insane, and he could confirm, confirm his conduct to the law. So she was establishing that he low IQ, but competent, and he knew how to obey the law. The jury found Ann's murder was especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel, involving, there was torture and depravity of the mind. Like, the scene was pretty gruesome, and the details were pretty damning and pretty disturbing. So Gary was sentenced to death. The Tennessee Supreme Court affirmed the conviction and death sentence in 1993. The court concluded that the evidence supported the verdict, that the sentence was not arbitrary, and that the aggravating circumstances had been proven. In its opinion, the court called the murder one of the most brutal and sadistic killings it had reviewed. But the legal fight continued. Gary filed a post-conviction petition on May 18th, 1994. Hearings were held in 1996 and 1997. The post-conviction court denied relief as to the guilt phase, meaning The murder conviction remained standing, but it granted relief on the penalty phase, finding that there was a reasonable probability the sentencing result could have been different if more mitigation evidence had been presented. That meant the conviction stayed in place, but the death sentence was no longer standing in the same way that it had after the original trial. In 1999, the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed the denial of post-conviction relief on the guilt phase. Gary's arguments about ineffective assistance during the guilt phase, investigative services, and jury composition did not overturn the conviction. Gary kept fighting, trying to get this overturned. He got the death penalty overturned, but he was basically saying he had ineffective counsel and was trying to get the guilty verdict reversed. But the courts held fast on that. Gary remained convicted of Ann Robertson Jones's murder. Now, Gary was actually up for parole in 2023, but as the vote came about, of course, it was a no. The victim's family, came forward and made sure that Gary stayed in jail. So he was denied parole in 2023. He's going to be up again, I believe, in 2027 is his next time that he can petition to be paroled. But it doesn't look like he is going to get paroled, if I had to guess. If you're like me, you're probably wondering what happened to April. April was 14 years old when Ann was killed. Under Tennessee juvenile law, minors fall under the jurisdiction of the juvenile court system rather than adult criminal court, unless prosecutors formally petition to transfer a juvenile to stand trial as an adult. Juvenile court proceedings remain confidential and handled separately from adult criminal convictions. And she gave testimony that made the state's case possible. Nothing ever happened to April, and I'm not sure how I really feel about that. On one hand, she was a young 14-year-old girl who got mixed up with a truly horrible and despicable man, someone that could have manipulated her. On the other, she helped kill an innocent woman brutally. But she did come forward and testified. April was a lot of things here. She was a child, she was a witness, an accomplice, and one of the only people who ever told the public what happened inside Ann Robertson Jones's home. And that is the story of the murder of Ann Robertson Jones. It's a hard story to tell, and it's a hard story to sit with. I left out a couple of little details about the attack as far as kind of the sexual nature of it when it came to Ann. I just didn't feel like I needed to say it, didn't want to say it, honestly. But there's a few other details in there. It really didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. It was pretty heinous. But this story was a little tough, not just because of the brutality of what happened, but just because everything surrounding it. You have this young girl who was a witness, and I honestly, again, I don't know how I feel about her getting off kind of scot-free, and I don't understand her mother and the boyfriend just letting her have this relationship with this older man. It's kind of strange to me. But Ann, Ann was 42 years old. She was a mother. She was a local business owner. And she was living in a town that so many people associate with, like I said, family trips, mountain vacations, and childhood memories. Like, I really enjoyed my time in Pigeon Forge. It's a great place, and that contrast is part of what makes this case so disturbing. Pigeon Forge is a place many of us know, through bright signs, busy roads, Dollywood, the Smoky Mountains, but like every place, it has stories beneath the surface. Some are beautiful, some are strange, some are deeply dark. And this is one of those stories. And at the center of it, I hope we can remember Ann, not simply, for what it was done to her, but as the person whose life was taken and whose family was left to live with the consequences long after the headlines and the trial and the appeals faded from public attention. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Southern Blueprint Podcast. If you enjoy this show and want to help support what I'm doing, one of the best ways to do that is by joining the Hidden Pond Lodge, it's my Patreon community. It's also where we have our book club and our bird club, and a growing group of people who are helping build this thing from the inside. As always, thank you so much to my producer, Corey Insco, for putting this all together, making me sound amazing. And I appreciate all of you being here, tuning in, and y'all, I will talk to you soon.